Welcome to our webinar today, Students with Disabilities, Instructional Support that Facilitates Learning. With our society's currently enlightened approach to education to mainstream students with disabilities, if your experience is the same as mine, every year you probably have one or more students in your classes who has a disability of one type or another. And when this happens, I am sure you are like me, you try to accommodate the student as much as you can. But often, I'm not sure exactly what to do, or if what I am doing is what would be the appropriate accommodation. That makes today's topic a particularly important topic. I also think that if we know the instructional support that facilitates learning for students with disabilities, it should help us focus on the instructional support that will facilitate learning for everyone. Our presenters today are experts in this arena. Heidi Abraham is a clinical professor at Brigham Young University in the area of curriculum and instruction for students with mild to moderate disabilities. She teaches an introductory special education course for secondary education majors. She also trains and supervises pre-service special education teachers. Nari is a PhD candidate at Brigham Young University in the areas of educational inquiry, measurement, and evaluation. She specializes in learning and instruction, and she has been the lead author of Making Accommodations and Adaptations for Students with Mild to Moderate Disabilities, and she has co-authored textbook chapters on instructional strategies for students with disabilities. Mary privately tutors students with disabilities, and she's also the mother of a special needs student, so she has received part of her graduate training in statistics in my course and is my all-time star student. So we have two experts with us today who can help us with these issues. And so ladies, please tell us how to design instructional support that facilitates learning.
Thanks, Paul. As you mentioned, I am a mom of a student with disabilities. My son Ryan has learning disabilities. When he was 4, he was diagnosed with disabilities, and all through his years in school, this is Ryan right there, he was included in general education classes. And as a parent, it was not only important for me to have him included in general education classes, I wanted him to make academic progress. And that really reflects kind of where society is heading, and what you mentioned, Paul, at the beginning, that there really is in our efforts to include our students with disabilities in general education classes. Over the past 30 years, the numbers included have increased, and they continue to increase, where more than half of students with disabilities are included in general education classes for at least 80% of the school day, if not more. And with No Child Left Behind, the emphasis is not only including them, it's being accountable for the progress that they're making as well. So that in the past, kids with disabilities were excluded from assessment. They didn't take assessments, and their progress wasn't necessarily being tracked with other students. And so now the law requires that those students take the same assessments as other students, and that we are tracking their progress, and schools have to track how they're doing. So it does become very important to provide supports for them to help them learn. In this session, our objectives are, first, to just describe some characteristics of students with mild and moderate disabilities so that we have a common language and know what we're all referring to. And then secondly is to describe accommodations that align with students' instructional needs. That's what we'll be focusing on. Specifically, we will be talking about learning disabilities. Learning disabilities is a category, a disabling condition under the special education law. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is not a special category or doesn't have a special designation, but it is a very prevalent condition. I think it's one we're all aware of. Emotional behavioral disorders are high-incidence disabilities. They occur at high rates in the population. And mental retardation, which is also being currently referred to as developmental disabilities. Heidi and I are just going to kind of take turns going back and forth talking about these things, and we'll let Heidi talk about learning disabilities and attention deficit. So go ahead, Heidi.
Okay. These are the ones you wanted me to talk about?
Yes.
Okay.
Did I get it backwards?
I think so, but I can talk about these. I know some things about these, so we can go that way. try. That's fine. Okay, so students with learning disabilities, this is the most common disability you're going to see in your general education classes. You're probably already very familiar with it. 50% of students in special education are classified as having learning disabilities, so very common disability area. And students with learning disabilities, what's kind of unique about them is they generally have a normal IQ or possibly even an above average IQ, but for some reason their academic performance in one of these 5 areas that are listed here is not up to their potential. So we classify students in areas of reading, writing, speaking, comprehending, or math. And what we often see with students with learning disabilities is that they have kind of peaks and valleys in their academic performance. So they may be great in science, but really struggle to learn to read, or different areas like that. So that's typically the academic profile that we see with students with learning disabilities. I would say some of the common myths and misconception about students with learning disabilities is that, first of all, that they don't have normal intelligence. A lot of times we assume that because they're poor readers, they don't have those abilities to perform and progress. So that's a really important thing to be aware of, is that they do have high ability, but for some reason there's a disconnect in their learning, their ability to understand reading, that sort of thing. So that's something to be aware of with students with learning disabilities. And then some common areas or things that we will be talking about more would be just a lot of times we want to think about ways to help that student to learn in our class if they don't have the ability to read, or if there's something that is standing in the way, still being able to learn that subject area that we're teaching. So that would be the area of learning disabilities. And attention hyperactivity disorder, I'm going to actually turn that back to Nari. Would you be comfortable with that, Nari?
Yeah, we'll flip-flop on those. Sorry about that, Heidi.
That's okay.
Like I said, this is not a category under special education law. They actually list it as other health impairment, but it's very prevalent. They don't necessarily qualify a student with this category, but most all of your students with disabilities will have issues with attention. We'll discuss that more later. But it's characterized by problems with attention, being hyperactive. I think that's what we mostly think about when we think of ADHD. But it also involves kids who are real impulsive. They just act out on impulse. They're the kind of kids that don't seem to be thinking before they're doing something. And the condition is also characterized by problems with organization. They're probably the kids in your class who have the really messy desks, or their homework just kind of looks like it's just unorganized, and the handwriting is not very neat. They have real issues with organization. So it's not just an attention sort of condition, it's also an organization, organization in terms of how you organize your work, as well as just how you organize yourself when you're doing things. And so it really impacts a lot of kids' lives, not only in their academic functioning, but in their social relationships as well, especially with being impulsive. That can become an issue when they interact with their peers. If they're the one that butts in on conversations and doesn't wait their turn, those types of things can be problems for them in establishing relationships with their peers. One of the myths and misconceptions about attention deficit is that the kids purposely choose not to pay attention. I actually interviewed a teacher about a student in her class, and the student really had significant problems with attention. And the teacher's comment was, I think she chooses not to pay attention. She just doesn't want to pay attention in my class. And one of the, I guess, conditions of this particular disorder is that it's uneven. So you see the kids sometimes really hyper-focusing. If they're really interested in something, that video game or that movie, something like that, they just give 1,000% of their attention. But the inattention is really manifest when they have to do a boring or tedious task. That's when you see real significant problems with attention. So it really isn't a choice. They have different filtering abilities and different abilities to focus and maintain their attention. And because of that, you're going to see real inconsistent patterns in their academic achievement. They may do really well if something they're really interested in and something else that maybe is perceived more tedious to them, you might see their performance really suffer because of that. Okay, the next one is the emotional behavioral disorders. So Heidi, if you want to take that.
Sure, that'd be great. Okay, so emotional behavioral disorders, these are your students that were usually the ones that we are not our favorites to work with in class. A lot of times they can be aggressive, they can be verbal, difficult to work with. They struggle to develop normal relationships with their peers and with adults in the school. Their moods will have significant mood swings, difficult emotional control, so where one student may react in a kind of typical fashion, this student would have an extreme reaction emotionally. And then they often have difficult time coping with changes or things that are happening in their world. Another common characteristic we see with students' emotional behavioral disorders is that they blame outside external forces for what's going on in their lives. So they can't see, they don't feel like they have any locus of control, or if the decisions that they make don't affect what's going on in their world. Some common misconceptions of these students is that, again, the same kind of idea with students with attention deficit disorder. These students with emotional behavioral disorders are often blamed for their disability or seen as being responsible. And of course they're responsible for their behavior, but a lot of times their ability to deal with situations, they may not have that ability to work through things. Another area that's misunderstood a lot is that we're very familiar with our students that are have external behaviors, such as, like I mentioned before, verbally aggressive or talking back to a teacher, that sort of thing. But sometimes we're not as familiar with our internalizers, students in this area who are internalizers, and they're having the same difficulties. They struggle with relationships and emotions and mood, but they are internalizing all of those experiences. And so they're often a quiet student. We may not notice them in our classroom. It may not seem to be a problem, but we should be aware that they're dealing with a lot of those same areas of concern. And then another thing to be aware of with students with emotional and behavioral disorders is that they're our most likely group of students to drop out. And so when these students drop out, they're not necessarily becoming stellar members of society. So we want to help them to be more successful and find a good route to transition out of high school, because that helps everyone involved. So that's really important. Their achievement pattern could be very similar to a student with a learning disability, and sometimes students have both emotional behavioral disorders and a learning disability, so they would, again, have peaks and valleys, but they may be good at one subject area and really struggle in others, and the same as we see with students with learning disabilities. So, and we'll have Nari talk about the next one, which is mental retardation.
Okay, mental retardation or developmental disabilities, they're characterized by adaptive skill deficits, poor academic work, and the need for some functional support. In general education classes, most likely you won't have kids with severe mental retardation in the classes. Probably the kids with the IQs that are just at the very bottom of the normal curve, sort of within that first standard deviation, just a little below. That's probably the kids that will be in your classes, in general ed classes. They tend to have the low IQs. They might be referred to as slow learners. What's a myth and misconception about your students with mental retardation or developmental disabilities are that they can't learn. That because they're slow learners, they just are not able to learn. And so it may be tempting for teachers not to have very high expectations for them. But they can learn. Their rate of learning will probably not be the same as other students. But they are capable of learning, and they are capable of making progress. My son ended up graduating from high school with a standard diploma, and he had a 3.5 when he graduated. It wasn't a college prep curriculum, but he graduated and did well in high school. And, you know, people could have said, well, he really shouldn't have been able to do that, but he was capable of making steady progress throughout his years in high school. And so these kids really can learn. Their achievement pattern, though, does tend to be just low across all academic areas. Because their IQ is low, they're going to struggle in math, reading, and all academic areas. Any questions about the disabilities that we've discussed thus far?
No.
We good? Okay, we'll move on then and talk about common characteristics of students with disabilities. We've just kind of given you a quick orientation to high-incidence disabilities. And there are, as we mentioned, differences between all those disabling conditions. However, across all those conditions, and for most students with disabilities that will be serviced in general education classes, they have common characteristics of cognitive problems or impairments. And these fall into the categories of concept formation, being able to learn and understand new concepts, new ideas, memory, being able to process things while they're learning them as well as store them in memory, as we mentioned, attention, and motivation, being motivated to work and engage in academic activities. So what we'll be doing is we'll talk about each of these areas, and then we have specific examples of accommodations that go along with some of those issues for kids with disabilities. We've tried to provide examples across a range of grade levels as well as math and some statistic examples. These are kind of generic examples and really can be applied to a lot of different content areas. So Heidi, if you'd like to go ahead and can discuss content formation.
Okay, great. Okay, so our students with disabilities will struggle with this idea of new concepts, particularly as they try to understand the subtle differences between different concepts. So as they learn something new, they might try to classify it into something they've already heard before rather than understanding the characteristics that are different about that specific concept. The other issue to be aware of is that our students with disabilities struggle with reasoning, which is going to affect, again, that understanding to decipher different concepts or ideas, and then also language deficits. And every new concept is surrounded by new vocabulary and this idea of understanding language. And so that often becomes a barrier to them when they're trying to learn new ideas. Some areas that you can look at for helping students with concept formation is, first of all, just keep in mind the idea that our students with disabilities don't self-generate good thinking skills or metacognition skills. So a lot of times we have to help them structure ways to learn better, or this idea of how to learn. A typical student may look at new information and have a lot of strategies for what to do with that, but a student with disabilities is going to need some specific help in how to decipher new learning. And so some things that we can do are, we have the examples and non-examples. So when we're presenting a new concept, we want to not only share some examples of that concept, but also share some non-examples of that concept to help students to really decipher what's going on with that new information. The next area would be compare and contrast. So if we can teach students how to take a concept and look at common characteristics to understand what's new about this information and how that differs from something else that they've learned before. A common one that we use with compare and contrast is a Venn diagram. You might have seen that used quite a bit, so that would be one to use there. This idea of abstract information is really hard for our students to learn, and so we want to try and start with something that's more concrete, moving to something that's semi-concrete then to the abstract. So for an example, if we wanted to teach students division, we would start by using actual objects that they could manipulate, then moving to paper, pencil, and then actually doing some division problems or story problems even that are more abstract with that division idea. And then finally, this idea of breaking instruction into step by step. As we're teaching students, we can help them understand specific steps that they can follow to solve problems or to learn new information. Again, creating that method or learning strategy for getting the new information across. Okay, this is one idea that you can use specifically to help students understand concepts. Here on the side here we have different triangles. So this would be a common topic that we might be teaching students. but they need to understand the specific characteristics of the different triangles. So across the top, we have characteristics of, that you would commonly see in triangles. And what we've done is a plus sign if that's something you would see in that triangle, and then a minus sign if that's something you would never see in the triangle, and then a plus minus if it's something that might happen. So for example, with an equilateral triangle, we know it has equal sides, so we put a plus there, but because it's equiangular, we wouldn't have a right angle or an obtuse angle, although we would have an acute angle there. So as we look at this, the other nice thing is it helps students to see what's happening with these different triangles. For example, here they all have acute angles, so we can kind of talk through that idea with students. So a nice way to help them to see the subtle differences between different concepts that you're trying to teach. The second example in concept formation is called task analysis, and task analysis means exactly what it sounds like. It's taking a task and breaking it into steps that you can follow to do that task or to follow a process. So if we wanted to teach students, a common area of concern in math is story problems. We know a lot of our students really struggle with that. And so if we wanted to task analyze how to do a story problem, we can break it into steps. And so here on this problem, we can teach the students to first read the problem and then teach them to draw a picture of what's happening in the problem. And this is kind of a visualization strategy to help them to really visualize what's going on in this problem. So they could draw that out and then label the picture with known information. So in our problem up here, we know that there's 1,000 miles between Chicago and New York, and we know how fast each train's traveling. And so the students can mark that on their picture, and then helping them to identify what's unknown or what they need to solve in this picture or in this particular problem. And then the next step for them would be to write an equation to solve for the unknown information, and finally to solve and check their work. And so if we wanted to use this procedure, we would model with several story problems this process, and then do some guided practice problems where the students could apply the process and then finally have them do some problems on their own using that. Okay, the next area I'm going to talk about is memory, which is, again, a common concern of students with disabilities. And a lot of times teachers will say, you know, I worked with this student, we learned this skill, and the next day it wasn't there. And that's something we hear a lot. And that's because what's happening is the student is getting that information in their short-term memory, but they're not getting it to transfer into their long-term memory. So students, a lot of times we can get them there, but we can't get them to generalize to long-term memory. So when they go to do it the next day, or sometimes in a different setting or with different materials, they don't have the ability to still use that skill. And so what we need to do is have the students engage in lots of practice opportunities to move from short-term to long-term. The other issue is that students struggle with retrieval, or getting the new information, finding where it is in their memories. And like Nari was talking about, the students with attention deficit disorder that have a messy desk or have a messy backpack, that same kind of thing is going on in their mind, and so they might have trouble organizing what's going on in their mind. So where to store information, how to go back and find it, can be a real struggle for them. So we have to teach them strategies to be able to do that. Okay, so a couple of ideas for memory. One thing is we want to do a lot of repetition. Our students, a typical student may need to practice something 7 times, and then a student with a disability may need to practice that 70 times. So just knowing that they need a lot more repetition than your typical student. And then they also need review. So if we're learning different skills throughout the week, then we want to schedule in some review time each day to go back and talk about those different skills that we've learned about each week so that it stays with the student. Some other ideas then to look at would be to help teach the student how to talk out loud through, as they're working through things, to elaborate, to break things down or to chunk, or looking at using some memory strategies or mnemonic strategies to help them to learn new information. And then sometimes we just need to accommodate by providing the students something like a fact sheet with multiplication or division facts if they just can't get those into their memory, or a prompt sheet such as a list with formulas to solve problems because they may not be able to get that into memory. So providing that as an accommodation is a good idea for students. some specific things that we can do to help with memory. One idea is something called class-wide tutoring teams. And this is where we take our whole class and divide them into dyads or partnerships. And when we're dividing our students into partners, we want to pair high-performing students with medium, medium with medium, and then medium students with low. If we put a high and a low together, sometimes they don't work very well together because there's such a discrepancy in their achievement, and two low students are often not good partners to make academic gains. So that's kind of what we want to think about there. And then for this particular idea, we want to give the students a teacher-prepared study guide. And on that study guide, you'd want to have things that are pretty simple ideas that students can just practice getting into memory. So math facts, formulas, definitions would be good ideas to use here. You probably wouldn't want to use extensive problems for them to solve because this is a kind of a quick activity. So this is things we want to rote memory kinds of things. And then the way it works is one partner asks questions on the study guide of their partner for 5 minutes, and they're taught to praise the student if they get the answer right and to correct the students if they get the answer wrong. And so they're trained to do that, and then they switch roles, and the other students can ask questions on the study guide for 10 minutes. And this can be built in, twice a week or 3 times a week to help students with those kind of factual memory kinds of things, and then a quiz at the end of the week is good to have students earn points on for their progress with those. Okay, a couple more ideas for memory is this idea of mnemonics, and we've all used them. They've helped us out. These are just some different strategies for mnemonics. The first is you can use something like a rhyme. So this is twiddly-dum, tweedledee-dee, around the circle is pi times 3, but if the area is declared, think of the formula pi r squared. So it helps the student to remember the difference between finding circumference and area of a circle with a nice little rhyme, and just a good way for students to remember things, putting things to music or rhythm helps to get it to stay in their minds. The second idea is an acrostic, which is using each letter of the first word of each word in a sentence that ties back to something else. So very common acrostic, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, ties back to math order of operations. And there's lots of these that can be used to help students to remember different ideas. And then the third area is an acronym where each letter of the acronym stands for something. So again, commonly used is SOHCAHTOA for sine, opposite over hypotenuse, cosine adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent opposite over adjacent. And a way to help students remember is to talk about, to tie SOHCAHTOA to something else. So in this example, they've tied it to someone named Chief SOHCAHTOA, and you can tell a story about that person to help kind of get it into the student's memory, that word that will help them later to remember things. And these mnemonics are actually things I just pulled off the web, so they're easy to find. They could also be teacher-made, or even have the students come up with mnemonics that work well for them to remember things. And I think that is it, so I will turn the time back to Nari.
Thanks, Heidi. We'll kind of come back to talking about attention. I'm just going to explain a little bit about what's involved with attention and then suggest some accommodations to address problems with attention. Attention is something that we all use every single day. For most of us, it's just a very unconscious process. We filter and we focus our attention constantly. For a child in a classroom, there's a lot going on in a classroom, especially large classrooms with a lot of students. And there's a lot that a student has to filter, figure out what's relevant and what's not relevant to pay attention to. The teacher's voice, the sound of the projector, somebody mowing outside, or things like that. And so attention involves filtering and focusing. So once you filter and determine what needs to be paid attention to, then it's focusing the attention. And once attention is focused, then the task becomes sustaining attention. And I think we all have issues with that. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm in a class or maybe a webinar like this, and I'll notice, oh, I was thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, or, how many papers I have to grade, or something like that. So sustaining attention is always an issue for most of us. And then, as I mentioned before, attention involves being able to organize and pay attention to details, focus our mind on details. Your kids with disabilities struggle with these areas, especially the filtering. Their ability to filter just isn't the same as other typically developing children. It's a lot more difficult for them to filter the relevant from the irrelevant. So if that projector is going and the teacher's doing a PowerPoint, that it's like it's calling to the child, pay attention to me. And so it's very hard for the student to focus the attention and realize, in that sort of subconscious way, oh, I don't pay attention to that. I pay attention to the teacher, not the conversation going on in the back of the room. As I mentioned before, kids with disabilities have particular problems when tasks are perceived as boring. And that's just because their ability to sustain attention is not the same as other children. And it's just much more difficult for them to focus and sustain and maintain their attention on something that doesn't have interest to them. And then you'll notice, especially like in math, that they really struggle with paying attention to details. Signs and addition and subtraction problems, multiplication and division, paying attention to when a number is a negative number or a positive number. Those are all issues for kids. Sometimes I've watched them work, and it's just almost like their hand is writing or doing something, and you just think their mind doesn't know what their hand is doing. And that's just kind of because they really struggle to be able to focus their mind on what they're doing and attend to all of those details. So those are issues for the kids. Some accommodations that can be very effective for them. I'm just going to say these real quick, and then I have examples for these, so I'll go through examples. Are teaching students self-monitoring and self-talk strategies to reduce errors, provide organizers for them, help fill in those organization deficits, reinforce on-task behavior, and tap into student interest. So I have an example of that. I've got a self-talk example. When you think about how you learn and how effective learners learn, it's probably something we don't even realize that we do, but a lot of times we'll talk ourselves through a task or activity. I don't feel like math is one of my strong areas, and so when I open a spreadsheet or have to do something, I have to talk myself through what I'm doing. I just finished a statistics course last semester, and we were doing regressions and linear combinations, and there were some linear combinations that, there were 6 or 7 steps to do to be able to figure out to solve the problem, and I had to talk myself through every step to make sure I was doing that. Your kids with attention problems haven't developed those habits. That just isn't something that they naturally do, so teach them how to do that. You might think, oh, I'm going to have a noisy classroom if I have all these kids talking to themselves. Well, you can teach them to talk in a number one voice, the quiet voice. And if everybody's doing it or other students are doing it, your kids with disabilities aren't going to feel strange or awkward doing that. But it really helps them focus their attention. For example, if they're saying, well, first I add all the numbers, you can see how that would make them pay attention to what they're doing so their hand isn't just kind of writing without them knowing what it's doing. And then if they said to themselves, then I divide by the total number, and they're going to have to pay attention, oh, what was that total number, and go look at that detail, and then that gives me the average. And then just by having to say that and talk themselves through the process, that really helps them focus their attention in ways they probably wouldn't do otherwise. The next example is a self-monitoring example. Just as most kids with disabilities have issues with kind of talking themselves through things, that's really not happening. They don't tend to have that inner dialogue. Self-monitoring is also a challenge for them. And you can just have simple little checklists made up for specific procedures that they just kind of go through and check off when they've done it. I know when my son was learning how to do ratios and proportions and comparisons and things like that, labeling the numerators and denominators are really important. He would frequently get that mixed up. So just teaching a simple self-monitoring, teaching them how, well, here's a graph. First of all, read the graph and read the line that you're going to write the ratio for. So in this particular line, there's 8 reds. And then so the student would do that and check it off. Then write the labels so that they would remember, write the labels first. You're going to have reds on top. You're going to have that total number on bottom. And check that off when that's done, and then write the ratio, 8/30. Over time, once the kids practice this, it becomes more automatic, and you can sort of fade the self-monitoring. But the self-monitoring really does serve to focus their attention on what they're doing and help them attend to those details that they might not otherwise attend to, and it really does help reduce errors. The next example I have sort of combines what Heidi mentioned earlier about task analysis, as well as this provides organizational support. I don't know if students use Excel to do Scatterplots or if they do some on graph paper, but this is just a simple way. We have the steps of the process, write the title of the plot, label each axis, write the scale, and then plot the numbered pairs. So we're telling them how to do it, so they're paying attention to those steps again, and then showing them where to write their responses so that they can organize what they're doing, so that they can write the title right here, and it's going to be organized and they know where it goes, and that they can write the labels as well as fill in where the scale goes. And over time, again, you can fade that, but at the beginning when they're learning new skills, it really does help with that attention and organization. Okay, and then on this page, are there any questions so far about any of this?
Yeah.
Okay. Doing good? Okay. This is an example of story problems. As Heidi mentioned earlier, story problems can really be challenging for most students, and especially challenging for your students with disabilities, because it's not only involving math ability, it's also involving reading and reasoning. You're having to break apart that story problem to find out what's important, what's not important, what's relevant, what's irrelevant, and then you're having to determine, you know, what is the math operation and what words in that are important for me to pay attention to, and what does it mean, and then I actually have to do math. So all that needs to go on before the student even begins to solve the problem. So graphic organizers can really be useful in helping students to be able to organize their work. And these are just simple ones for very simple problems. You could have these blank, and the students could be taught to fill them in. They could look for, are we starting with the whole amount and then going smaller? Are we starting smaller, going larger? Just label where they're going to put things, and that really facilitates organizing and being able to solve the problems. And same, this is just at the bottom, another example of the same idea, where we're just putting labels on the parts of the problem that they need to pay attention to. So this really does help them focus their attention, and it addresses those organizational issues that the kids have. Okay, and then finally, praising the kids. You know, these are your kids with disabilities. Life can just be hard. You know, they have these deficits. People in their lives may or may not understand. School's hard. Social relationships are hard. You know, learning disabilities or disabilities are not just disabilities in one area. They're disabilities and disabling conditions that impact all aspects of these kids' lives. And so it's really important that as much as we can be positive with them, that we're positive. And it's sort of this idea of catch them being good, especially your kids who have issues with attention. You know, it's really hard for them to pay attention to things. It's not like other kids. Their attention system just is not as efficient as other kids. So if you catch them and find them, wow, paying attention for a minute or so, let them know. You know, either give them verbal praise or give them a praise note. You know, awesome, you completed, you know, you stayed on task and completed 10 problems. For kids with real significant attention problems, you're probably going to need to praise them after completing one problem, you know, or half a problem or something like that. But the point is to help them understand that, you know, you can pay attention. I'm going to notice when you do, and I'm going to reinforce that, because that's really a great thing when you are able to focus your attention, even when it's something that isn't of particular interest to you. So it's that idea of catching them being good and really trying to reinforce what they're doing well, and that actually teaches them and helps them to learn those attending behaviors instead of constantly pointing out what they're not doing right. Because when we point out what they're not doing right, it's like, okay, but what am I supposed to do? So it really helps to teach them as well. Okay, the next topic is motivation. Your kids with disabilities will probably struggle with motivation for a couple of reasons. Motivation involves interest in valuing something as well as skills to be able to do that. You need both of these to be motivated to do something. If either one is lacking, kids are going to have issues with motivation. You know, I don't know about you. If you think of something that you're not particularly good at, are you very motivated to do it? I'm not good at sewing. My mom wanted me to learn how to sew when I was growing up. And really, to be honest, I just had no interest in learning how to sew. Didn't interest me whatsoever. And not only did I lack interest, I really couldn't sew a straight seam. So I had problems with the skills as well as the interest, and consequently, I never learned how to sew. But both of those things are very important and really have a significant impact on kids' motivation. Your students with disabilities will have a more limited range of interest than other children in your class. You know, your bright, talented kids might be interested in just a very broad range of topics and subjects. Maybe you have a kid with disabilities in your class who is just interested in dinosaurs, or that's the big thing. You know, if math doesn't involve dinosaurs, they're really not that interested. So their range of interests will probably not be as broad as other children who don't have disabilities. As well as those skill deficits that Heidi and I have already mentioned are going to become issues for them. You know, if reading is a struggle, or if basic math operations are a struggle for them, if they don't actually have the skills necessary for a particular task, they're not going to want to engage in that task. And that's one of those conditions where no matter how hard they try, they're still not going to be successful. And I think we all know that. I think most of us know whether we have the ability to do something or not. And I've yet to see a child with some mild disabilities not engage in a task when you actually teach them the skills to be able to be successful doing a task. So the skills become very important in academic work. So some accommodations that align with those issues are assess and teach necessary prerequisite skills. Find out where the kids are and then teach those skills that they need to be successful. Provide scaffolding or support that would enable them to be successful. And then finally, make lessons relevant to students' lives. And some examples of this are the scaffolding and prerequisite skills. An example of scaffolding is if you have that 10th grader that really never did learn those math facts, then provide them with a calculator or provide them with that math fact sheet, because there's so much they can't do in math if they don't know how to. They don't know their facts and don't know how to work with them. So that's the type of support that will enable them to do something that their disability is preventing them from doing. Also, younger kids, sometimes just teaching them strategies of how to do things is also a good way to scaffold and support them in acquiring new skills. When I work with younger children with disabilities, a lot of them have problems counting up, just counting up from one number and adding a couple more, like from 5 adding 2. They get confused about, oh, do I say and count 5, or is 5 not counted? So I would just teach kids a simple strategy of slap your leg and say that number you're starting on, so slap and say 5, and then count on your fingers up 2 more. And that way they don't make the mistakes, and that little strategy helps them to learn to count, which is a necessary skill. And then, again, that idea of teaching the prerequisites. Kids need to be able to know how to order data from smallest to largest before they can identify quartiles or something like that. So really being aware of what are the skills students need to be successful learning this objective that I've written for this particular lesson, and can I teach some of those skills so that students are more likely to be successful. And one thing I've really thought was great about this meeting within a meeting project is that it emphasizes student-centered learning activities, and that's really important for motivation, especially with your kids with disabilities, but I think for all of us like it when learning's fun. Learning doesn't have to be boring. But I know some of the lesson plans that have been developed as part of this project really emphasize that. There's the popcorn lab one where I teach students about normal distributions by making the popcorn in the microwave, and students can hear it starts out slow. There's all this popcorn in the middle popping and then kind of tails off at the end. And who wouldn't be interested in counting and graphing how many chocolate chips are in a chocolate chip cookie and then eating it? Or doing something like tap into their interests. What do the kids care about in your classes? analyze the scores of the high school team or a local college team, or for maybe some students, what video games do they like to play? What movies do they like to watch? Something that they can graph and actually feel like they have an interest or can contribute to the discussion in the class. And I just think that's really important, not only for your kids with disabilities, but for all students in classes, tapping into interest so that they want to learn, so that learning doesn't seem so laborious and something that they don't want to engage in. So any questions about any of these topics thus far?
No.
Kind of move on and summarize what we've done and talked about then. So the process, basically what Heidi and I have discussed and illustrated, is it's a simple process. It's analyzing students' learning problems, kind of getting to know your kids. Even though a student in your class may have that designation as having a disability, no two students with disabilities are the same, just as none of the rest of your other students are exactly the same, with exactly the same learning profile. So analyze that student's learning strengths and limitations and identify what are the issues for this student. I actually interviewed some teachers about some of their students, and it was kind of interesting. I had one teacher talk about a student who had a writing disability. I mean, that was the student's qualification category for needing special education services. And in talking to the teacher, it was very interesting, both the special ed and the general ed teacher, somehow there was a disconnect between that writing disability and the problems the student had getting things on paper. They both, in independent interviews, mentioned, well, this kid is kind of lazy. I give him a test, and other kids in the class write a full page. This kid writes 2 sentences. So really being aware and understanding what is this child's learning profile. And then once you've identified that, providing those supports that will minimize the impact of their limitations and also teach skills that are necessary for them learning new information. Like Heidi mentioned with the mnemonics and other strategies for remembering things, those are skills that they can learn that enables them to remember the things that they need to be able to remember. So it's kind of a simple process. Hopefully we've illustrated some things that don't seem too big or too overwhelming that would fit into sort of the natural things you're already doing in your classroom that, other kids may benefit from, but your kids with disabilities really need to be able to be successful in the classroom. So Heidi, do you have any comments to summarize?
I think you did a great job just letting us know that there's when we do small things, it makes a big difference with our students. So, yeah, great job.
So, any questions?
No.
Well, I think we're good then. Thank you so much for participating, and we really appreciate this opportunity to share our knowledge with you. If you have any questions, we're happy to provide our emails. We would be happy to answer questions you might have or to share other ideas about accommodations. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. This certainly applies also, I think, to a lot of my students that are not official special needs students, but struggle with math or statistics or difficult upper-level math things. So this is a good refresher on how to see things kind of from their perspective. So I appreciate your information.
Nari and Heidi, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Every time I had a question, you answered before I could even ask it. My takeaway from your presentation is that the special need of students with learning disabilities is for us to focus on incorporating and emphasizing good pedagogical techniques in our course design and delivery. Striving to address the needs of special needs students reminds us of the needs of all of our students. Well done, and thank you.